Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Jewish Museum. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the manager of public programs here. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation, Abraham and Isaac Interpreted, featuring Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky, Rabbi David Ingber, and Rabbi Charles Savenor. This discussion was inspired by a new installation of George Segal's 1978 sculpture, Abraham and Isaac, on view in our collection galleries on the third floor. So if you haven't had a chance to visit the sculpture, please join us after the talk. For details on all of our upcoming public programs this fall, including talks with curators Rebecca Shakin on Edith Halpert and the Rise of American Art, or senior curator Claudia Nassin on scenes from the collection Zodiac, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. Now I would like to introduce this morning's speakers, beginning with Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky. Dr. Kalmanofsky is Blanche and Romy Shapiro Associate Professor of Bible and became the Dean of the Albert A. List College of Jewish Studies, JTS's undergraduate school, in 2018. Previously, Dr. Kalmanofsky was Associate Vice Chancellor, serving as an ambassador for JTS, teaching in communities across North America, building relationships with supporters, and sharing the impact of JTS on the Jewish world. As Associate Professor of Bible, she teaches courses on biblical literature, religion, and feminist interpretations of the Bible. In her writing and teaching, Dr. Kalmanofsky combines contemporary ideas and critical methods with traditional text study, teaching students to be careful, creative interpreters of Torah. Rabbi David Ingber promotes a renewed Jewish mysticism that integrates mindfulness and physical awareness into mainstream postmodern Judaism. A major 21st century Jewish thinker and educator, his rich perspective, open heart and mind, and full-bodied approach to Jewish learning has brought him to speak throughout the United States and worldwide throughout Canada, Europe, and Israel. Rabbi Ingber's distinct approach to Torah, rabbinical teaching, and ritualistic practice is informed by his own personal seeking and learning from a wide cross-section of sacred traditions and faiths. Rabbi Ingber is the founder and senior rabbi at Romemu, a community that began in 2008 and today hosts over 600 households. And Rabbi Charles Savenor serves as director of congressional education at Park Avenue Synagogue. He previously served as the director of congregational development at the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. He was an international resource for over 600 affiliated conservative synagogues in the areas of leadership, organizational development, strategic planning, volunteer engagement, youth programming, and enrichment. Prior to these roles, Rabbi Savenor was the Associate Dean and Director of Admissions at the Jewish Theological Seminary and Associate Rabbi at Anshe Emet Synagogue in Chicago. Now, if you can please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky, and then Rabbi David Ingber and Rabbi Charles Savenor will join her in a moment.
There's a computer here. Excellent. All right. Great. So I'm just here to say hi and welcome everybody and give a little framework for what's about to happen. So I'm extremely excited to be here. I'm excited to be in conversation with colleagues, and I'm particularly excited, and I want to say this is the first time I've actually ever done something like this, to also be in conversation with a work of art. So Judaism, in many ways, is defined by having a conversation with its canonical texts. In fact, you could say, I would say, that Judaism could be described as being one long conversation, which we are all part of. And that conversation, the words that we use to describe when we are in conversation, those texts we talk about that we're engaged in midrash, or we're engaged in parshanut. And those are the words that we use when we are in conversation with our canonical texts. I just want to state the obvious, that I think this is a piece of midrash and is part of that conversation. conversation. And we are all, as we are engaging today in talking about an ancient text and how that ancient text is seen in this piece of art, are also engaged in that conversation. So to provide some framework, my colleagues and I are a little more well-versed in the world of text than we are in the world of art, but luckily we have a video that actually is that you can hear from the words of the artist himself that we're going to play first, and then we're going to gather together afterwards. So the video will happen now. Do I have to do anything? Do I have to push anything? No. Okay. Don't touch anything.
I started working in plaster mostly because I was disgusted with my own painting. I wanted to move into 3 dimensions, real space. I never think of the significance of plaster, only that it's a marvelously malleable material. It's chalky white. It takes the impression of any texture. It flows like water. It dries like rock. I started casting from life, was astounded at the mysterious results that I was able to get, and I feel yet that I haven't exhausted all the possibilities. I always insist my models suffer from my art. Yeah, let me just wrap you up with this rope, Alex. We'll just... I'm only good for SM.
We know.
Okay. S670. Here you go, Herbert. Let's see, the classical one was like that, I think, something like that.
Grab him by the hair, maybe. That's more violent.
You mean like this?
Yeah.
I'm commissioned by a private art foundation to make a memorial sculpture to be given as a gift to Kent State University. I decided to use the Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac, which is really about the dilemma of a father commanded by his God to kill his own son to demonstrate his faith in his God. You know what this is, what else is involved in this?
No.
Besides the story.
No.
This whole sculpture is supposed to be a memorial for the killings of Kent State. I'm invited out there, and the passions are as strong now as they were 8 years ago. And
They are?
They are. I was absolutely surprised.
Wow.
The conservative element believes that more students should have been killed. They're appalled that there's a questioning of obedience to government order. And so, it becomes a genuine tragedy in the sense of both sides well-meaning, convinced of their point of view, and neither able to see the other point of view. So this whole thing becomes a metaphor, a very complex metaphor for that whole situation.
For sacrifice. The idea of sacrifice.
The idea of sacrifice, and Abraham totally convinced that he was right, and if that required the execution of his son, he was willing. He was called a great man for that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is another element of the tragedy. I have to pick a model who has a mental life that I respect. And I count on some kind of magical transference that my model's active mental life will translate into the physical charge of these muscles moving around. And it does work that way somehow. There seems to be a truth about that. Alex, move your head forward so I can just get a piece of cloth here. I don't think that I will change people's minds. I think it may take some explanation on my part. I certainly will have to let people know how I've arrived at this image. I don't mind doing that because I have a sense that I was that student yesterday, like I'm the father today. The story of everybody's life is that turn of the wheel, that reversal of role. The legend, the story of Abraham and Isaac is so powerful and contradictory. It's far from simple. There isn't a scrap of information that describes anything of what Abraham was feeling or thinking, nor what Isaac was feeling or thinking. It's an extraordinary piece of literature in that it is the boldest telling of a story. And the fleshing out is completely up to each reader. That fascinates me, because I suppose I'm in the business of fleshing things out. I thought the sculpture should deal with the moral crisis of older people in charge. I wanted to use the Abraham-Isaac Old Testament myth because for all its terrifying cruelty and violence, it has a happy ending. God, or his angel, stops the execution, and the life of the boy is saved. I asked another friend to pose as Abraham. This one is Lucas Samaras. For the purpose of this piece, I like the way Lucas came out. Lucas was able to express with his body very clearly all these issues going on. The back like a ramrod, the relentless decision to pursue this abstraction, being unwilling to be deflected. Well, Lucas is like that in his life. He drives very hard for his mental ideas. And then Lucas, on his own, clutched his left hand in that gesture of tension, which for me, speaks volumes, which I think is the key. You know what? I have a reason for it. Abraham stands here. He's got the knife like that, and you would see him with his left hand clutched.
That's right.
I was very glad to show the piece in Minneapolis because I wanted to show the piece out of a political context, and I wanted to show it in an aesthetic context. Right foot, left foot. I wanted it seen as a work of art. A work of art with a strong overlay of literary philosophic levels, but primarily as aesthetic grouping. I never have pretended to be cool, and I don't care about abstraction. I don't care what other people tell me is important. In order for me to find the universal, I have to be very specific.
I'm moderating, which is the only reason why I'm sitting in the middle. I will use the mic too. Is it on? No? No? Is it on? Yeah? No? Somebody help me? Oh. Now it should be on. Yes? Okay. Wonderful. So I'm going to get us started. I actually have to say I have never been to a day event at the Jewish Museum. So, and I think my colleagues and I were not 100% sure the setup for this. And so we kind of hoped that this would be more of a conversation that we would begin, but then folks would be able to engage with us. So hopefully we can still do that. We'll see how it unfolds. I've been told that there is a possibility for a mic to float around, so people should not feel at all silenced. Let me just get us started by saying that I 100% agree with George Segal. I think Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, is probably the greatest work of literature of all time. And certainly a piece of literature that is timeless and continues to be of interest to all of us. We love it, we hate it, and we can't avoid it. Though I have to say, as a teacher of Torah, I have often avoided it because I feel like it's almost too complicated and too familiar for us to even engage with this text. In the last few years, I actually have returned to teaching it, which has kind of been its own experience. But I wanted to say something about the sculpture itself. What we're going to do is really focus on the text because, as I said, that's sort of what we know, and there are probably people in this room, I am sure, that have more knowledge around the art, and that would be wonderful to get their perspectives as well into this. But I'm not sure if people know this piece of information, which is that as George Segal said, this was commissioned as a memorial for the Kent State Massacre. And does anyone know what happened to it? It got rejected, right? Which is itself just an absolutely remarkable thing. And when I was asked to do this talk, I was actually invited and came to look at the piece. And I believe there are some letters that, I'm not sure if it's spelled out, and again, people in this room that might in fact have more knowledge than I do about this may know why precisely, on what grounds it was rejected. And so what I may say now may not be at all correct. Does someone actually know? I'm curious, I thought I saw a hand. No?
I heard it would stimulate more violence.
Okay. So it would stimulate more violence, which is actually quite remarkable. I don't know. I'm going to give you a guess, and it's sort of the guess that I'm giving you is just a guess, but I think it's also a way in to frame the conversation, right? Which, and again, it's so interesting to think about this in context of today and conversations that are going on today, particularly around police violence. But I think that, and George Segal said this in the video, in some ways his reading, his choice to use the sacrifice of Isaac, right? And that itself is a fascinating choice. He chose to use that as the subject of his memorial is really quite remarkable. And his understanding, what he seems to be saying, is that he feels that this ultimately, as he said, kind of half, joking, but it's true, it ends well. Right? It's a horrific story of horrific violence, but it kind of ends well. And that in essence, what I think he's saying is that it's a story about that privileges, this is how I'm understanding it, that privileges restraint over violence. It's a story that ultimately comes to privilege compassion over violence. This is, I think, how he's understanding it. So he says it's a very complex metaphor, which it clearly is. It's a complex story, multiple meanings. Thank God, right? Doesn't spell, that's what I love about the Torah, is it doesn't spell everything out. We have to be in conversation with it. But he would say that this is a story about restraint over violence, about compassion over violence. Or compassion over passion, let's put it that way. And I think, and this is me, Amy Kalmanofsky reading into this, that I think that part of the reason why it was rejected from Kent State is that it was too critical in some ways, of the older generation that was willing to do the violence. I could be wrong. This is provocative, but it's sort of something that I've been thinking about. That in some ways it was too critical. And it wouldn't, it sort of was saying that you did not have a right, you fathers have no right to kill your sons, which is in fact what happened, right? The older generation at Kent State killed their metaphorical sons. And so, again, I don't know if that's the reason why it was rejected, but it's sort of something that I've been thinking about. And if you know more, I would love to know that. I just want to say, yes?
So, first of all, it's great to see everybody. Welcome here. One of the things that I read, and what's that again? I'm Charlie Savenor. I'm actually Rabbi Charlie Savenor, but the only person I make call me Rabbi is my mother because she paid for it. But anyway, one of the things that I've read as I've become an expert on the sculpture in the last week, I'm joking, of course. One of the things I read is that it's not just about restraint, is that I think the Kent State University felt it was sympathetic towards Abraham. As you know, because Segal could have chosen, if you want to tell the story of the binding of Isaac, there's 22 verses associated with it. He could have chosen any one of those verses, but that particular moment is a statement in itself. So that's something I'm sure we'll talk about later, but I think it's the sympathy towards the oppressors and not towards the victims, which was the reason they didn't want it on their campus.
Right. Interesting. It's all very interesting. And again, there may be, I assume there's archival information too as well. So here's what I want to do. I want to sort of focus in on the text, again, in conversation with this piece of art. And I want to raise the question that, whether or not this story really is a story that privileges restraint or compassion over violence, right? And I think that's a really, fascinating question to ask in the context of this sculpture. So there's several sort of guiding questions that I want us all to think about and that we'll be responding to. So here they are. First question is, does Genesis 22 express compassion? Does God have compassion for Abraham? After all, he doesn't make him do it, one could say. Does God have compassion for Isaac? After all, he doesn't kill him, right? So is there some sense that God has compassion for these characters? Does the story express compassion? Does Genesis 22 privilege restraint over violence? Is the point of the story to restrain from violence? By the way, for generations, this story has often been read as an anti-sacrifice story, right? Whether or not there was I'm looking at my colleague Phyllis Tribble, who's one of the greatest Bible scholars of all time, who's in the audience. We can, happy to fill her in. But biblical scholars for generations have discussed whether or not, how prevalent was human sacrifice in ancient Israel's culture, right? And this story has often been read as an anti-human sacrifice story, right? So in some ways, it's about, if you follow that reading, it's about restraining from violence as opposed to doing the violence. And the third thing I want to say, and this is just an interesting thing that we've been talking about among ourselves, which is to some extent, I think what Segal was doing with this piece of art in the Kent, yes, it's a memorial, certainly to the events that happened at Kent State. But I also think, and this is, I think what you're saying, it also was a form of protest, right? It had a message to be said. I do think it was critical of that older generation. And again, it's something interesting to think about how this particular story, or why this particular story became the subject of his protest, the subject of his memorial. He could have selected any number of stories, even within the Bible. So it's interesting that he did that. So I want to start by looking, you guys have the story in front of you, and we're going to do a little Torah study first, and then we can have more free-form conversation. But I want to I like to say to my students, I like to tell you where I'm going to take you. You don't necessarily have to follow me, but I'd like you to know where we're going. I basically do not read this at all in its context, in its biblical context, as a story at all about restraint. I don't read this as a story at all about compassion. I read this as a story about submission. That is what I think this story is about. And I believe that what this story is about, the actual biblical story is about, is that in fact you have to be willing to do violence. And it's Abraham's willingness to do violence that in fact is praised. So in some ways, the reading that I'm going to offer you now, by just looking at the text itself, just the opening psukim, the opening verses, I would say in some ways is in opposition to the way that Segal is responding to this story. I see this story as being about the willingness to do violence, and I see this story as being not at all about compassion or restraint from violence. You guys can disagree with me, okay? So we're going to look through the verses very quickly. I'm going to show you where I see that submission. And also I want to say that I see the submission not just in Avraham, not just in Abraham, but also in Yitzchak as well. So I'm going to read the text, is that all right, in the Hebrew, and translate it. You guys have the Hebrew and the English in front of you. And I'm just going to point out a few of things in the text itself that would support my reading of seeing this as being a story almost entirely about submission. And again, you can disagree. So the story begins in chapter 22, verse 1. Vayihi achar hadvarim ha'ela, and it was after these things. V'ha'elohim nisa et Avraham, God tests Avraham. Vayomer alav Avraham, vayomer hineni. And God calls out to him, Avraham, Abraham, and what does Abraham respond? Hineni, here am I. You guys, we don't have that much time to go into real detail, but I want to say this, hineni in the Bible is kind of a technical term. It means I'm here to do service, right? Whatever you're going to tell me to do is what I'm ready to do. So it has its big words, right? So he's basically saying whatever follows next, I will do it. What does God say? Vayomer, kachna et bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. V'lech lecha el eretz hamoria. Va'alehu sham la'ola al echad harim asher omer alecha. So God says, take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, go to the land of Moriah and offer him up there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I'm going to say to you. Now the rabbis like to say something. Is there any doubt who he's supposed to take up with him? No. It makes it very clear, right? So you can't possibly say he doesn't know who's the subject, because of course Abraham has another son, right? But that's not the one that's being picked. So God is very specific. You take your son, your beloved son, your only son. Who is that son? That is Isaac. And you take him up on the mountaintop as an olah. Now, the rabbis love to say, well, maybe he didn't really say, in the Bible, an olah is an olah. It's a burnt offering, right? And the rabbis like to say that at this point, maybe he was being a little vague, and God is saying, just take him up on top of the mountain, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. From the biblical perspective, it's very clear who Abraham has taken up that mountain, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, very clear what he's asking him to do.
Hold on, can I just say one thing, which is every translation is an interpretation. So you mentioned correctly that it says your only son, but here in the English it says your favorite son. So which is also, it might also bespeak our uncomfortableness with this story, the way that it's laid out. So, yeah.
You want to add anything before I, no? I'm going to try to get us through the text very quickly. So in verse 3, what happens next? Vayashkem Avraham. He gets up early in the morning. When you do something early in the morning in the Bible, it means that you are eager to do it. And it also has very technical side to it. You were told to do something by God. Guess what you're going to do it? You're going to get up early and you're going to do it, right? So he gets up early to do this. In the morning, he saddles his donkey. He takes his, this is Vayikach et shtei na'aravito. He takes his two servants with him, and Isaac, his son. V'yivaka atzei olah. He cuts the wood for the burnt offering, And he gets up and he goes to the place that God tells him to go. I'm in verse 4. On the third day, Bayom HaShlishi, Vayisa Avraham et Enav, he lifts up his eyes, Vayar et Hamakom merachok, he looks and he sees the place that God has selected for him from a distance. Vayomer Avraham el Na'arav, and Abraham says to his servants, I want you to think about this, Shvu lachem po, you stay here, im hachamor, with the donkey, va'ani, and I, v'hana'ar, and the lad, neilcha ad ko, we will go up to that point, v'nishtachaveh, we will worship, v'nashuva, and we will return to them. This is one of the greatest verses, and again, one of the most enigmatic verses you can have. So do you think that this shows that Abraham is willing or unwilling to kill his kid? Why unwilling? So the biggest thing, who said that? Just like it's a little dark. So the biggest thing is the fact that he seems to say, Nashuva, we are going to return, right? Which is, and the rabbis pick that up. He seems to be saying, suggesting that he has no intention of coming back without Isaac. Is there any way to read it differently? Yes, in the back.
I think he's willing because he doesn't want to be stopped, so he tells them we will be back.
So this is a darker read, and I actually think one that I would agree with, or at least I would suggest that we think about, right? Because you have to ask yourselves, why does he not take the other two lads? He leaves them behind, right? He doesn't want witnesses or anyone to stop him. And one could very easily say that he's just very cunning at this point, and if they suspected that he would be in fact doing this, they might have also stopped him. Right? I'm just saying it's ambiguous. You can read it positively or negatively.
But there's one other way to read it, which is that Abraham is on a, what do you call it, mission from God, and that perhaps he and the Almighty are going to return, maybe without Isaac. So, which actually supports your reading, which it's about the mission and not about the people.
That's actually beautiful.
Thank you.
All right, quickly through them because I'm just a few more verses and then we'll open it up. So it's Vayikach Avraham et Atzei Ha'olah. Abraham takes the wood for the sacrifice. Vayasem al Yitzchak beno. This is the most incredible moment. And what does he do? He places it onto his son. Just think of the visual of that. In a sense, he's acting out even at that moment as this boy is going up to his death. He is already in, he's the sacrifice on the wood, right? He's enacting what is in fact about to happen to him, which I want to suggest communicates or conveys to Yitzchak a sense of what actually is going to happen, right? In some ways, it's a subtle way of telling Yitzchak what is going to happen. So he places the wood on him. Vayikach bi'ado ad ha'esh. He takes the fire in one hand, and he takes the ma'achelet, the knife in the other, the flesh-consuming knife in the other. Vayechu shnehem yachdav, and the two of them walk in unison. Now this expression is going to be repeated several times in the story, and I want to suggest that every time it is repeated in the story, it indicates a kind of complicity among the characters. They are in agreement as they walk. So here you have a son with wood on his back and a father with fire and a knife, and they are walking together. I would say that they are both in this particular moment submitting to the fate that's going to happen to them. And what happens next? Vayomer Yitzchak el Avraham. Isaac then turns to his father and to his father, Vayomer Avi, and he says, Father. And his father says to Isaac, Hineni beni, here am I, my son. Any sense of what do you think that indicates at that moment?
No, it's
Use your mic.
I want you to just,
Yeah. To me at that moment, what I would say is the son at this moment, so the Hinenes have switched. So you have the Hineni in the beginning that Abraham is saying to God, I will do whatever you want. The Hineni in the second Hineni is Abraham saying to Isaac, I will do whatever you want. If you command me not to do this, I will do that. I think it's actually a moment where you see some waffling in Abraham's own psyche. And I want to say that at that moment, Isaac is all in. And what does he say? He says, as we famously know, right? Here's the fire, here's the wood, so where's the ram for the offering? And Abraham responds to him, Elohim yireh lo haseh lo olah b'ni, ve'yehu shnehem yachdav. And Abraham responds and says, God will provide the ram for offering. And then what do? The two of them walk together complicitly. So what I want to suggest, and this is sort of the jumping up, and I'm going to say one more thing and then we can open it up. To me, this is a narrative in its bones about submission. God asks Abraham the unthinkable to any of us, right? The unthinkable to any of us, and Abraham says, Hineni, I will do it. Abraham, in preparing his son to do this, communicates what he's about to do to his son. And effectively, Isaac submits and says, I will do this. Now, here's the problem, obviously, or the point is that God does, in fact, then intervene, and that is where you could say that God is saying, restrain from the violence, and that may be the case. Though I do want to say, and this will be the last thing that I will say on this, is that when the angel intervenes, God intervenes, and says, withhold, this is in verse 12, right? Don't harm the child. Don't do anything to the child. This is, to me, the most important verse of the whole thing, so I'll just read it in Hebrew. Vayomer, he says, Al tishlach yadcha el hana'ar, restrain your hand from the child. Va'al ta'as lo me'amah, do nothing to him. Ki ata yadati ki yireh Elohim ata. Because now I know that you are God-fearing. Now I know that you are a person who will submit to me at all costs to what I'm asking you to do. So in my reading, this is a narrative about submission and not a narrative about restraint from violence.
Yeah.
You should, and then we can open.
Well, yeah, so I'm David Ingber, and I think this whole exercise was actually an exercise in how almost impossible it is to read our sacred canonical text without asking questions about that text. And it's almost impossible to make it through a quote-unquote simple or literal reading of the text without asking questions and then superimposing or imposing or inviting or allowing or expanding on ambiguity. The text is rife with ambiguity. The kinds of readings that we do on the text are already privileging or the beneficiary of the way that we read texts, which assumes that the way that ancients read text is the way that we read text. Things like repetitive words or lacunae in the text where we think, oh, what's the conversation happening there? Or even, Amy saying beautifully that the hineni of Abraham, here I am, to his son, is a lock-in to the hineni of the previous response by Abraham to God, and then saying that now they have reversed themselves. That's already, in a beautiful way, an interpretation, or, there's an assumption there that one hineni connects to another hineni. And I think that the first question I'd like to ask and answer in a way is, really what the text means, it doesn't matter. It's the way people heard it when it was read and the meanings they took from it that then inform their lives really is essential. And what is clear is that even if a simple reading of the text is that this is a text about submission to God's authority or the divine authority, the willingness to do anything, even the most extreme act, which is to take a child that you waited 100 years or, to receive from God, the final promised, test. The rabbis say that this was the 10th and last of the tests that Abraham was tested, again, intertextually, connecting the word lech lecha, the two words that repeat themselves, v'lech lecha al eretz hamoriyah, with the first lech lecha, right? Go to the unknown land that Abraham received in chapter 12 of the book of Genesis. Now in chapter 22 becomes not just leave the land that I where you were born, and go to the land that I will show you, but go to the land where you will actually give up the future, right? Which is, of course, Isaac. Isaac is Abraham's future, right? And the promise of Lech Lecha, go to the land that I will show you, had with it explicit rather, progeny, right? Go to the land I will show you, you'll have children. And now in chapter 22, the final test, give up part of the promise that I made to you, right? Or see if I will actually ask you to go through with giving up on that promise. So we have all of this, how do we hear this? So even if the text is about submission, it's super clear that our generations of rabbis were listening differently and inviting a different kind of listening, the kind of listening and then information of your behavior that kind of listening invites, which is called midrash, the conversation. So already from the beginning of the rabbinic tradition, the rabbis had a problem with reading the text as only submissive, right? Even the narrative that you raised and then said that you don't necessarily read it that way, it's not necessarily whether it's accurate or not. The rabbis don't want to hear the story in that way. When they say that there's ambiguity in the word olah, or Holocaust offering, a whole burnt offering, they're inviting us to read the text against itself. They're inviting us to hear ambiguity where there shouldn't be ambiguity, as if to say they are protesting themselves through the act of midrash, this simple reading of the text. They refuse to let us get away with reading the text simply. Whether they're uncomfortable with the text, I guarantee they are. George Segal is uncomfortable with the text. I just want to say that I had never seen that midrash. And talk about meta, and mind, warping. The documenting of his own process is itself what they chose to show us in the documentary is itself a midrash on his own midrash. How many of you were thinking when you were reading it that he said, I chose to read a text that doesn't tell us anything about Abraham's feeling. We have nowhere do we have any writings on the feelings of Abraham and Isaac. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, you don't know anything about the Jewish tradition, do you? The midrash is rife with how Abraham felt and how Isaac felt, right? It's dripping all of the midrashic literature over the last 2,000 years. When the medievalists read Isaac as submitting himself to God's will and then learn from that during the Crusades to give themselves strength, to be willing to die al kiddush Hashem for the sanctification of God's name, they are reading into Isaac not just submission but joy. That Isaac went joyfully to his end. He willingly stuck out his neck in the midrash, not just saying, okay, I'll submit, but willingly stuck his neck out. And that therefore gave the Jews of that period the strength in reading into Isaac his own pathos, to do the very same thing when the Crusades came through. So it was amazing. I don't know how many of you, I was really touched by and challenged by the fact that the only thing that wasn't cast in plaster was the knife. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself...
And I think the rope too, but yes.
And what?
And the rope as well.
And the rope. And I thought to myself, there's midrash, he's midrashing. And so I just wanted, so we're going to open up the conversation, but I wanted to say that I found the choice of the text to be more than odd because the scene, as you said before, Charlie, the scene that he chose and the way that he read it, who's the Father, who's the Son, and even himself, in a little bit of the Bible that he said that he refuses to listen and care about what anybody says. His own art is protest. So he sees himself as the Isaac, I think, and who's protesting the universal application of art, and he wants to believe in the concrete and the particular, and he has to work in that way, and he refuses, and he actually identifies with the protesters and says that, the government is the bogeyman and trying to kill the protesters. We have to restrain ourselves. And I think that's the simple meaning of the text, right? V'lo chasachta et bincha. But it's just an odd place. And I think that the tradition imagines and faults Abraham more than the text does. Where the text rewards Abraham's submission, the 2,000 years of Jewish plaster over the, fleshing out, the plaster over this text is that Abraham should have known, if you're Kant, that there's no way a God, right? The Immanuel Kants of the world who read this text said that if prophecy means hearing God clearly, Abraham here should have known that this was not God, but a demon speaking to him, because there's no way that a universally ethical and moral God could have been speaking to Moses to tell him to do something that is universally abhorrent and unethical. So Abraham, in Kant's reading, should have said, I know, right, that my son is my son. I know that I can never murder him. What I don't know is who you are, because you can't be God telling me to murder my son, because those things don't go together. Or you can be the Zohar in the 13th century in Spain, which says that the word Elohim used, and I'm coming in for a landing here, that the word Elohim, which is one of many God names in the Bible, the word Elohim, which is distinctly used in different parts of this narrative, Elohim is a divine name, says the Zohar in the 13th century of Spain, which is Aspaklaria de lo Nehira. It is an unclear voice. And when the text in chapter 22 begins, Vayomer Elohim el Avraham, and Elohim specifically spoke to Avraham, it means that an unclear divine message was communicated to Avraham, and his job was to say no to God. Now that, of course, is not the simple reading of the text. It's not, and Amy is correct about submission, but it speaks to a current of protest that maybe George Segal was attuning himself to, that there is in the Jewish tradition, and I would add Segal's midrash to this, although the sculpture is not a protest. I wish that he had chosen a different image. I wish he had chosen an Isaac standing over Abraham, or an Isaac and Abraham standing face to face with the rope having been torn by the very knife, right? Or Abraham taking the knife to the rope and saying, we're in this together. I wish that his own, right, sculpture would have been a protest like the Zohar was, or like Immanuel Kant was, or all the other great rabbinic voices that actually protested the simple reading of the text.
Well, I mean, one of the things about the text is that the rabbinic tradition, which we follow, wants us to intersect with the text. The fact that we read this on, the high holidays, we could have chosen anything to read, right? Any choice, the whole Bible, take it. And on the climax for Rosh Hashanah, this is the text that we read. Clearly, the rabbis want us to grapple with the text. And I agree with you that every generation is going to wrestle with the text in their own way. One of the things that I just going back to the sculpture for a second, and I had the opportunity to look at it. And how many of you here actually volunteer as docents? Can I see? Fantastic, great job. So thank you on behalf of the Jewish people. One of the things that I noticed in the sculpture is are Isaac's eyes. That Isaac's eyes look glazed over. And Abraham's eyes, if you look from a certain perspective, are also sort of blank. But the way that the sculpture is put together, it looks like Abraham's looking down. But I was sort of fascinated by Isaac's eyes, because there's a beautiful midrash that in the process of submission, in the process of why ever we read this story, and honestly I'm not sure, but I know we read it as what do you call it? Kafka. That's what you believe, Amy, and thank you so much. What I was going to say is that Kafka says the stories that we remember most are those that wound us. Right? This story wounds us in some way. Anyway, so there's this beautiful midrash that says that Isaac, as he's ready to submit, lifts his head up. You see it in the sculpture, and that the angel who's watching over this to see that Abraham submits, like you say, that the angel cries and lands in Isaac's eyes, right? And those tears blind Isaac. And it was one of the pieces of the sculpture that I think is something that shouldn't be overlooked. But the question for us as learners of text and lovers of art and lovers of the Jewish Museum, which is all part of the same gestalt, is what else is Isaac blinded to at that moment? Mm-hmm. Right? What is distracting him? What's getting in his way? And this blindness, what does he carry on? Remember that when Isaac is put into the same place where he needs to give a blessing to his son, his favorite son, his oldest son, he's blind, right? He's lost. And so that's actually part of the story. I think that Segal does get, I'm not sure if he meant it, but I think that one of the things is, in the act of submission for the younger generation, of which I used to be a part of, in the act of submission of the younger generation, what did they lose at Kent State? What do we get blinded to when those who we look up to as authority let us down? Where words become platitudes, where words become empty. And I looked at the sculpture recently, really recently in the last week, and this sculpture, I think any good midrash is as timely and timeless as the original text itself. And I'm really appreciative of the Jewish Museum of including the sculpture here, because I think the sculpture is as much about the past as it is about the future and the present. And I'm not being political. I'm being a human being.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that midrashically, the midrash has a lot to say about those tears from the angels' tears. And it also has a lot to say about what takes place as much after the Akedah, right? The felicitous phrase of Adorno of after Auschwitz, right? That after Auschwitz there can be no poetry, or the aftermath of a trauma, right? The aftermath of the trauma, as it were, of Isaac is, of course, that Abraham and Isaac never speak again. At least the text never says.
They never walk together again.
They never walk together down.
They walk separate, right?
Right, they go their separate ways. And the death of Sarah, at least in the rabbinic mind, in the very next chapter, chapter 23, is very much connected in the rabbinic mind with the way of this Akedah, this binding of Isaac. And I think that the reading of submission, again, and you mentioned Phyllis Treble. I don't know you, Phyllis, but your work has impacted me and made imprints on my soul. If this is indeed a text of terror, and again, I'm not saying that you say this, but I ask this as a rabbi, and you raised this, Charlie, what is the impact of continuing to read this text in sacred space? And again, we have no control over how our texts are heard. And in a synagogue setting where there isn't a lot of rabbinic gloss on this, and if indeed, right, Amy is right in that the simple reading of the text, what is lifted from the text often, not always, is a willingness to do violence to one's own children for the sake of an ideal, or for the sake of something, right, that transcends them in some way, shape, or form, then reading it in sacred space, like a Rosh Hashanah or your regular Shabbat service, is a very powerful inculcating of that value. And we can all understand, maybe we can imagine situations where it does, where we do call upon our ideals are greater than our individual lineage or our individual children. But you have in literature of Israel in the last 70 years, invoking of the Akedah for the wanton, right, generations of children who grow up that we sacrifice on the altar of X, Y, and Z. And so it kind of raises the question of what are we sacrificing continuously by continuing to read these texts in a sacred way and in public space, and what people hear or don't hear in that.
Can I just build on Can I build on one thing? I agree with you that the trajectory of Isaac, and I'd say the Jewish people overall, is influenced by this one moment, right? Whether it's submission, or as the overarching theme. But sacrifice, I think, is also one of the most important elements of the text. And because what immediately follows the Akedah, if you look at the text for one moment, at verse 20, at the end of verse 20, we have the Akedah, everyone's saved. Isaac and Abraham walk down the mountain, not together, they walk down on their own. And what comes next, right? Abraham gets a birth announcement that his brother's family back in the old country, there's a new grandniece, there's a wedding, there's an ufruf, there's a chuppah. Oh my God, right? It's amazing. It's actually the contrast. It usually gets overlooked, especially on the high holidays, as people are not necessarily as much dreaming about redemption as they are about brisket. Is at that moment, this is a throwaway, right? The simple reading of the text is fine. This actually just tells us how Isaac is going to end up being with his beshert, right, later on. But actually, it's really painful, right? In some ways, it's the story of the Akedah in Holocaust literature, in Israeli literature is, in the Holocaust where, parents in some cases had to sacrifice their babies in order that they would be quiet so they wouldn't be found when they were hidden. In Israel, parents sending their children to the IDF to fight on the front line for the sake of the Jewish people. And this text is about us in America, where we're having babies and b'nai mitzvah and ufrufs and weddings and all the rest of the great things we do. What does it mean for a life of faith for the sake of the Jewish people? What do we sacrifice for being on this mission from God?
Beautiful. Okay, so we got some questions, and we can have some conversation. So I don't know if there's, there's a mic. So you can be in charge of who gets yes.
It's very hard for me to interpret this as an act of submission because it's never completed. We can't know his motivation, we can't know what was in his mind, that's very clear, even though we have interpreted what it may be. But I don't see that he submits to anything because it's never completed act. Also, when Abraham tells Isaac, God will provide, there will be something, so I will save you, maybe he really does believe that.
So to just simply consider it an act of submission, maybe it's really an act of trust.
And listen, it could be, but I think that what Amy, I'm speaking for you, but I'll speak also for the text. The phrase that Amy lifted up at the end of the story, Al tishlach yadcha al anar ve'al tas lo me'uma. Don't send out your hand, implies that Abraham was actually about to send out his hand. And there needed to be a voice in the story that says, stop the energy of your hand, and don't even make a nick, right? And I see now that you are a Yirei Elohim. I see that you are I can see now, meaning in your willingness to do this. Velo chasachta, which of course is a very ambiguous word. It should say shelo chasachta. There's some literature about biblical scholars who talk about that. Velo chasachta. That you have not restrained yourself, but that clearly feels like the reward of the biblical voice.
I would also say just technical thing. The word yirah, which is often translated as fear and awe, in the biblical context really does come to mean a kind of obedience, right? And so there is a certain sense that, it's true, we will never know, and your point is well taken. And I'm not so sure that trust and, submission are necessarily not related, right? He's still sort of giving in and allowing, whether he thinks that God is going to prevent it from happening, he's still, in essence, submission. I just want to say, because there's something that you had said, obviously my read of this is submission. I actually do feel that submission is a vital religious posture, right? I think that, I think we're uncomfortable with thinking about submission. I think what you raised about the limits of submission, right, is really interesting. Right? Is there a way that, Abraham obviously submitted and was obedient, and the question the rabbis asked, should he have said no? Right? Should he
fight with God about
absolutely? And the Bible deals with false prophecy, right? It deals with the fact that there are false prophets, and how do you know who's a true prophet and who's a false prophet? So it makes that distinction. Right? It's wary of that. So the question of how do you listen? Who do you listen to? Are there limits to who you listen to? Are there limits to how far you're willing to go? These are really interesting questions.
And before more questions, also just want to say that of course the most famous philosopher to deal with the Akedah was not Kant, but Kierkegaard. the Danish philosopher who wrote a whole book on his own theory about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, where he said, in fact, what you mentioned, which is, and what Amy was highlighting, that submission and trust can live together. That was what made Abraham the knight of faith, that he was willing to be doubly bound, as it were, himself in the belief that God would provide and also that God wanted this impossible moment, and he held both of them.
But can I, just one other thing, which I mean, Abraham, I'll be brief, it's my forte, because I'm a rabbi. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that Abraham is told to go where to do the Akedah? Is he told to go to the valley? No. Is he told to go to the plain? He's told to go up to this mountain, right? Where our tradition believes the temple was built, right? What happened in the valley down below is where the Canaanites did human sacrifice. One way to read this text that does go into a submission is Abraham's told to go to what ends up being moral high ground, right? See what submission does to you, right? Look down. Do you want to be that? Right? One of the things that I wish they were elevated a little bit more than they are, but the sculpture really does sort of echo that. And the fact that it's three-dimensional, because only when I think historical geography is a really important way of reading the text itself. Understanding where Abraham stood and what he was looking down, or I would say looking down, looking at and looking down at are significant parts of the story that we don't always get as the text is, as we read it, is flat.
So agreeing with Rabbi Savenor when he talked perhaps God, when Abraham said, and we will return, he was talking about God. That also happens during creation when God says, and let us create man. So that could be interpreted in many ways, and that could have been him being somewhat humble or feeling somewhat godly, that he is using the word, and we will return. A second point, we refer to Isaac as a boy because that's what it says, but a boy could also mean because he's his son. Isaac also went, he could have, and even in the artist's portrayal of him, he's strong. He doesn't appear a small little lad. He could have said no. He put his hands out to be tied. So I think this is more of a story of following orders. And I think what the artist was saying is, how far will we go to follow orders? The same way that they did at Kent State when the National Guard came in. And do we put ourselves on the same level as God? And did Abraham put himself on the same level as God, as almost speaking his word? So again, it's midrash, whichever way it's interpreted.
It's all good. And something that hasn't been mentioned that I've been chomping on the bit to say is Stanley Milgram's famous study of obedience to authority. And his study on the lengths that people, even law-abiding, ethical, moral individuals, are willing to go, even in the face of the suffering of another who is in the room. If those who don't know Stanley Milgram's study on the obedience to authority, read that book. And that usually, I think George Segal would probably, I don't know him, I don't know what he would say, but that I think is what he's pointing to, is your point exactly, which is the limits that we as sheep, even 37-year-old sheep, as Isaac, according to the Midrash was, according to the chronology, the 37-year-old, vibrant young man was willing to go along because his dad said so, and his dad didn't even tell him what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And there is in that, like the limits, like he's raising that question of, are all of us going to be Abrahams? And of course, a Jew, or who believes in the submission model, will say, well, it's one thing when God tells you to do something unethical, and immoral, but it's another thing when a human being tells you to do something unethical and immoral. And I think that is exactly the point of contention. Is the God voice in the Torah, right? Is that to be privileged over a human, or is that both?
I know this is terrible, right? We shouldn't be doing this, but I just want to say one thing, because I just thought about this for the first time ever, right? Which is, maybe this is obvious, but one of the things that seems to me clear in this story, and I want it to be clear to you all, is when I say submission, part of what I'm showing is that in fact there's a willingness to submit, right? Which is a certain sense like you give over to that authority, but you decide to give over. There's a moment of decision. And I think that moment of decision is really quite precious. And part of what and fascinating, right? So part of what I'm saying with Avraham is that first Hineni, right? He decided to do that. Vayashkem, he got up early the next morning with full awareness. And part of the way I'm reading, and you don't have to go there, but part of the way I'm reading that moment with Isaac is that by dressing him, putting the wood on his body, taking the knife, taking the fire, he also knew what was happening, right? And he also said Hineni, and also was willing in that moment. So to me, I don't want to be sheep. I don't want anyone to be sheep. I also have to say I love the George Segal sort of saying he identified with Isaac and then he sort of identified with Abraham. And the beauty of the story is that you can kind of move through life and identify in different ways. I don't think any of them are really sheep, but I think the power to decide to submit is also worth noting.
But I just say one thing in response to you. Hold on, just one sec. I don't think that, Isaac doesn't want to be a sheep, right? But isn't it interesting that the son that he favors is a hunter? He knows what it's like to be hunted, if you will. He knows what it's, that Isaac's son, that it's Esau, right? And I think, again, this is about one sculpture, one moment in time, but I think it's an interesting question in terms of what does the trauma bring out in Isaac? It's not the son who's sort of associated with faith that Isaac favors. It's the one that knows how to protect himself that he gravitates towards.
Okay, I want to bring it back a little bit to the sculpture here at the Jewish Museum because I would be a little more showing people as laymen, as a layman, what people would be looking at here. And when I studied the sculpture myself, it struck me, as you talk about submission, it's blind obedience. And to bring it into the current time and the current day and where this sculpture was made and when it was produced, this was the conversation about the blind obedience. So while the Bible story gives us a lot of food for thought, when we relate it back to the sculpture, I think that we would talk as docents or whatever about the idea of blind obedience and relate it to the Bible and call it something different like submission. But when I think about why Kent State rejected this sculpture, maybe that was a fearsome sort of thought, that it was blind obedience versus thought-provoked violence.
I just want to just say one thing about the sculpture. I think that George Segal unwittingly chose, the sculpture doesn't reflect what he was trying to do. It's the dissonance between what he was attempting to convey and what he actually produced seems to me dissonant. And it's kind of, we're not sure why they rejected this sculpture, but he's trying to use the text as, at least in the way that he said about blind obedience, but the text, as Amy was saying, seems to be signaling submission, which is strange. Again, anyway, so I'm sorry.
But hold on one second. I think it's important as a docent. I think it's important as a docent, right? And that you have the text there as much as possible. Because Segal's midrash is he takes one snippet, right? But what's not there? The ram isn't there. The angel isn't there. We don't see God there. There's no hearkening to Sarah. The irony, and I love the fact that the museum has the Time magazine cover, and the picture, that prominent picture, right, is where's Sarah in this? You don't have to be a Bible scholar to do this. You just say it's part of the story. What's happening that Segal doesn't include in his midrash? The fact that the ram isn't there means he's isolated one part of the story. But I think as a docent, as an educator, it's our responsibility to say, I think in any case, there's always different angles to a story.
I think that I think, and I agree with you, I think we need to bring ourselves back to 1969 when Kent State happened and what the world was going through at that point. And it was a start of when students were rejecting their universities, and they wanted a voice of their own, and they were denied it, and that they denied the government the right to come in there and silence them. And I think the same thing is happening right today with China and Hong Kong, where the students have a voice that is being shut down, and that they are not being able to submit to what is being done to them.
I think we're running a little long, but I'm going to try to get to a couple more of you.
I wanted to ask, the fact that it is in the prayers for us who pray in the morning, that we say the whole text, is it meant to bring us up to a certain level as Ola, or is it for Hineni? Why is the text there in the morning that we say every day in the prayers?
So the liturgical inclusion, the question is the liturgical inclusion of the full chapter of chapter 22 of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, appears in many rites, liturgical rites, and reading it is supposed to do something, which is what you're asking, what is it there for? And I would just, I'd suggest that over and over again in our literature, there is some merit accrued, and we use that term, that we would have merit for the sake of the Akedah, for the sake of Abraham's willingness, and for the sake of Isaac's willingness. It becomes meritorious for us to mention it because of the Hineni, the willingness of both participants to live a life submitting to Torah, submitting to Jewish tradition, submitting to the divine will, to God, as it were. And that often when we say that, it is for that purpose, to accrue merit for that, at least it's a very simple read in a way in the liturgy. I don't think that it's very complicated. It's about submission. It's about submission. It is.
So I would say it's such an amazing narrative that just by virtue, I can't imagine that there isn't some sense like, yes, it's about submission, but there probably isn't a single reader that would, that it's, as we've been saying, that it would sit well with. So it almost deconstructs itself, right? Because you read this and it's hard to not, question and pull back. So, but I think the shot of it is, yes, it's the virtue of both Abraham and Yitzchak of submitting to this.
Yeah.
The religious posture.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is something I've never done before, but I've been very moved by everything that all of you have said. But I want to focus on the idea of this blindness. I'm a docent here at the Jewish Museum for 48 years. I am told that I am part of the permanent collection. But I want to give the approach to blindness, being that I am legally blind, and I have gone through this process during these 48 years, and the museum has been so terrific, giving me the opportunity to talk about art I can't see, but I do have visual memory. Blindness is not two-dimensional. And I can tell you from my own experience that many doors have closed for me, but many more have opened. And I think Isaac had a vision that a seeing person cannot understand. And that he knew, he knew what he was doing. And I think we have to give Isaac more credit than we read about him and what is said about him for his life. It was, yes, he was blind, but he saw so much more than many other people understood in their lives.
So I just want to say one thing and just respond to that. It's beautiful, and I totally agree with you. I think that, speaking as a Bible scholar, Isaac often gets, sort of the short, whatever it is, short straw, short shrift. People don't. I actually, and I'm happy to give you this reference, but I actually have written about the fact that I think Isaac is, in some ways, the most whole and perfect of the patriarchs, precisely for this moment that happens early in his life. And just to give you, he's the only patriarch that doesn't actually leave. He's told that he can't leave the land of Israel. He's also the only patriarch that literally works the soil and reaps the fruit of the land of Israel. There's something about him that is, in some ways, I would argue and have argued, he's more fully formed than I would say Abraham, who takes 10 chapters of Breshit to form him, and Yaakov, who we could say never actually does get formed, right? Isaac is oddly, I almost want to say, whole and perfect in a way. And I think there's, so there's something about that I think is really beautiful.
And can I also lift up? I just want to say thank you for speaking from that place, because I think even the way that we have conversations about text, often the voice from within the character or within a human being we speak about it in very abstract ways. And I liked what George Segal said, that he hates abstractions, he wants to be very concrete. And you just made something very, that we might elide over, very real, and gave it three-dimensionality in your voice. And lastly, I want to say that the truth that trauma often produces great art, right? And that visions come sometimes when eyes or opportunities or things have been closed is a radically important truth, that pain and possibility are interwoven together. And so thank you for opening doors for us too.
Thank you for mentioning that as well.
That was beautiful. So I wanted to thank you for your interpretations. I want to thank you for your midrash. I think that every person has their own interpretation. My question is more about semantics. In the use of the word submission, are you actually talking about this is a story of absolute faith? Because I haven't heard the word faith mentioned at all.
Yes, I mean, to me, I actually, that is actually what I mean. And when I say that, I think that submission, I mean, it's interesting. Some of you may, I actually wrote a commentary for JTS where I distinguish between faith and belief, and actually consider myself to be a person of faith. And I think it is time, I mean, you're getting my religious profile, actually, because I am somebody who actually does find value within limit to submission. And I do think that's very connected to my faith, which is a certain sense, when I distinguish between faith and belief, to me, belief means certainty. Like you're sure something, I believe something is true, whereas faith is more aspirational. Right? I don't know that something is true. I hope that something is true. And it's a language that I'm more comfortable with, right, than to say I believe in. But to me, yes, I think submission, that's why I do think it is part of what it is for me to be a person of faith, is submitting to something that is larger than myself, something that I don't have utter control over, that I sometimes have to just submit to. I mean, we can go on and on, but yes, I would go in that direction.
And the word appears in the text. The word for faith appears in the story. Asher ha'amanta bi, that you had emunah. The word emunah, which is faith, which is Amy was speaking to, is very instructive because it means, it's actually not submission per se. It means from the word omen or aim mother, or to be held by an intersubjective embrace. To faith with someone is actually active. To faith with a principle, there's a dialogue in it. So one is faithful to some experience. So Abraham has had a powerful experience of God's presence that gives him the underpinning, the undergirding now in its absence, to remain in a posture of hopefulness, right? Now that this is no longer there, like a mother, right? The sense of my mother's not here, but I know she's there. That's what emunah is, that even in its absence, there's constancy for him. So that's really...
Yeah, I think we have to... So I just want to say on behalf, because I have a meeting to attend, so I have to head to my work. So I just want to say it was an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with all of you, to be in conversation with this piece of art. If you guys have any questions or comments or thoughts, I'm sure you can find each of us easily online, and wish you the rest a good day.